Welcome to the Ellevate podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. And now your hosts, Kristy, Wallace, and Maricella, Herrera.
Hello and welcome to the Ellevate podcast. This is your host, Kristy Wallace, with my co-host, Maricella Herrera. Hi, Maricella. How's it going?
It's going okay. Sorry I'm laughing, but you started saying the whole hello and welcome to the Ellevate podcast. And, as we near Mobilize Women Week, I don't know if you remember, but last year when we did Mobilize Women Week, the intro music we were using for each of the sessions was our podcast music.
Yes.
And so I was in my mind, ding, 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 ding. I'm losing it. I think I need a day off.
All right, let's do it. You do need a day off, Maricella. Well, we were talking about this the other day, but the challenge was that you need a day of rest and relaxation, and you would book some appointments. So we were trying to figure out if you should reschedule the hair appointment.
My hair appointment, which my hair appointment was more important than my rest and relaxation.
I mean, priorities. You gotta make these decisions.
Hey, look, my hair has a life and a mind of its own. If you've never seen my hair, listener, you don't have to go look for it. But I have big curly hair, and it is
beautiful.
It is a priority.
And it's beautiful and amazing.
Oh, thanks.
Yes. My daughter, my 8-year-old Morgan, has curly hair as well, and she and Maricella swap tips on her hair.
Oh yeah, she has great curls. She really does.
Yeah, I mean, partially her hair is so long. I think it's comes with age and also lack of styling, processing, dyeing, other things. But she does have great hair, and she loves it. She owns it.
So, I mean, I think Morgan owns pretty much everything of Morgan, which I really respect for an 8-year-old.
Yeah, she does. Although earlier today, our conversation, my side of the conversation went basically something to the respect of, "You are 8, not 18. We cannot start this attitude so soon." So she's at that stage. Everything's a battle, even if it doesn't have to be. But that's okay. Yeah. I support and encourage her, confidence in her ability to fight for what she wants, and I'm really proud of her.
You should be. All your kids are great kids. I haven't seen them in a while, so hopefully I get to see them soon.
I know. Well, I keep trying to get you over to Brooklyn, Maricella.
My outings in New York have been very close by to the Upper West Side in the last year. But now that the weather's nice, also, it's a good time to go out a little bit further.
Yeah. Well, let's get you here, and maybe we can then tape some of these intros in person.
That'd be nice.
Until then, today our guest is the unbelievable Leslie Zane. She is the president and founder of Triggers Brand Consulting. Just really a complete rock star. Triggers is a brand consultancy and a CMO advisory. And Leslie, beyond a business founder and CEO, is a thought leader, TEDx speaker, and author. So that right there should get you excited for all that's packed into this conversation. And without further ado, let's get to my chat with Leslie Zane.
Ding, 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 ding.
Hello, Leslie. Welcome to the Ellevate podcast. It is such a pleasure to have you here today.
I feel the same way, Kristy. This is a real honor. Thank you.
Of course, and I cannot wait to dig into so much of what you've been working on, which I think is incredibly relevant to our audience as marketers, as business owners, as consumers, especially in light of the world in which we're living and the impacts of that world. But I wanted to start first to learn a little bit more about you. And Leslie, I'm hoping you can share a bit about your story and the work you're doing today.
Absolutely. So, I am the CEO and founder of a company called Triggers. It's a brand consultancy and chief marketing officer advisory that helps client accelerate growth. And how we do that is pretty unique. What we do is we change brand preference at the instinctive level. What I mean by that is, that moment when you're in the supermarket and you just kind of reach for that brand that you buy over and over and over again.
Oh,
You don't
absolutely.
really know. Yeah, you don't really know why you're doing it. You just reach, you're on autopilot. So that is what we focus on is changing instinctive brand preference for our clients.
I cannot wait to learn more about this. I know some of your clients are brands that many of us recognize, from Hershey to McDonald's to Colgate, Tom's, which is one of my favorites. So tell us more. I mean, how did you get into this line of work? What did that path look like?
Well, it was an interesting pathway and definitely not straight up, that's for sure. You could probably describe my early career after Harvard Business School, which, by the way, when I went back then, it was only 24% women. I would describe it as a double glass ceiling. The first glass ceiling was that marketing, just like the world of finance back then, was still very much a man's world. And then the second glass ceiling was that my ideas were different from everybody else's. So that was a second roadblock. I worked inside brand management, which is a fancy name for marketing, at companies like Procter and Gamble and Johnson and Johnson, which were really known as the blue chip marketers of the world. And while I learned a lot there, I also found that marketing initiatives were very hit or miss. And I thought, how could this be? Here I am at P&G. If P&G doesn't know how to consistently drive revenue, and share growth, who does? So my ideas back then flew in the face of conventional wisdom, and that made it very tough. So, just as an example, I believed that what people liked and disliked was not predictive of what they bought. I felt that indirect cues like iconic images and symbols were more powerful than superlative claims like this is going to wipe out 98% of plaque. And I felt that companies were overly dependent on coupons and discounts, and that this created only fleeting gains and was kind of a race to the bottom. But like many unconventional thinkers, my ideas were pretty much dismissed back then. Because I was young, I was a woman, and I was challenging marketing rules that had been there since the days of Mad Men. So I started my company to really solve the elusive question of why do consumers instinctively buy the brands that they do over and over again, and how can you influence that rapidly?
I'm so curious about this because for me as quote unquote layperson, I hadn't really thought about it, right? And I know exactly what you're saying, being in the supermarket or at a store and just instinctively reaching for a brand. And I know it's probably not the, percentage of plaque that eliminated that's driving my decision. It's some sort of affinity, and it's definitely not conscious. And I I'm curious, how did you take this learning and take this work? What are some of the insights you've had that you could share with our community?
Well, I wanted to get to the root of that instinctive moment. And I just kept digging further and further. And in many ways, we were pioneers of what later became known as behavioral science. But I started my company back in 1995. And so a lot of my instincts about this were in many ways premature. So I heard a lot of not naysaying back then, but I didn't let it get to me. In fact, I used that as the motivation to start my company. So we pioneered an approach and were practitioners of this process called triggers, which we created, which was 25 years ahead of its time, and is only really becoming very popular now. And we have a competitive advantage in doing it.
So backing up to 1995, because you know I during that time, so much was still, I think, magazine ads and print and billboards, and we've come leaps and bounds as we leverage technology and various forms of media. Has your discipline and your perspective changed with the new influence of touch points, or is it grounded in that foundation that applies across the spectrum?
It really does apply across the spectrum. The fascinating thing is that we now know that about 90 to 95% of decisions, brand decisions, are made on instinct. And scientists disagree about what that exact percentage is, and they're still trying to figure that out. But everybody agrees that the vast majority is made by the instinctive brain, that moment of just, reaching. And so we spent a lot of time understanding how do we understand those subconscious drivers which don't show up in typical research. Just think about surveys and political surveys, like in the last few elections. They're always wrong, and the reason they're always wrong is because they just scratch the surface, and we're not really getting to the depths of what truly drives people to make that instinctive decision. And that's true whether you're buying something in the supermarket or you're going into the voting booth. We make these decisions on instinct.
All right, so let's fast forward to today, 2021. We're coming out of, you mentioned the election. So in the United States, a lot was happening on the political spectrum, but we've also had the pandemic. We've had great social change and a spotlight shown on many of the inequities and inequalities in our society. What does that mean for a CMO? What are their priorities for 2021 during this time of great transformation?
The chief marketing officer's job has exploded. They now have to do everything. They have a digital transformation that they have to effect, because obviously everybody knows that that's the way people are going to be buying today and into the future. So 75% of chief marketing officers are focused on digital transformation. 25% of chief marketing officers are focused on creating a more empathetic brand. 22% are focused on social causes. And the list goes on. And the brand has to do all of that and be a positive voice in this rapidly changing landscape that you just pointed out. So they have a tough time. But possibly the toughest thing about their job is that we are entering a period of slower economic growth. It's stated in a lot of different research studies that the next 50 years are going to be half the economic growth of the 50 years prior. And marketing is supposed to be the engine of growth of a company. So it's interesting to look at chief marketing officer surveys because it clearly shows that there's a disconnect. Chief marketing officers believe that marketing budgets are going to grow 5% or more in the next year. And unfortunately, their boards of directors think that it's more likely that those budgets are going to shrink by -2%. So what we do at Triggers is really to try to help those companies close that gap. And it turns out that when you do leverage people's instinctive drivers and instinctive barriers, you can actually influence sales and revenue much more quickly.
I mean, talk to me more about how you do that, of course, without giving away your secret sauce, but that seems like quite a barrier to me between, CMOs thinking about growth of budgets, other stakeholders and investors, shareholders thinking about the contraction of those budgets. And that kind of misalignment can be catastrophic, and obviously the chief marketing officer plays such a role in brands hitting their targets, connecting with consumers. So how do you counsel companies in that way? I mean, how do you work with them to identify those challenges and overcome them?
That's a great question. So, the most visionary chief marketing officers and chief executive officers understand that they need to do something differently. And they are applying our approach to step up their performance and do it in a way that's cost efficient. Because the old adage was in order to increase your share of market, you have to increase your share of voice, and that means more spending. But what we're trying to show them is that if you leverage these cognitive shortcuts that people have, that you can actually expand your market share and accelerate your growth without spending more money to do it. So that is obviously an appealing benefit. And so that's not the hard part. The hard part is unlearning the old traditional marketing principles. If you look at the whole area of marketing, it's just so fascinating. The principles that we all still use, that are still taught at Procter and Gamble and Harvard Business School, and I know because I was at both of those places, the rules were created back in the days of Mad Men, back in the 1950s and 60s. And yet we have this whole body of science, neuroscience, behavioral economics, psychology, anthropology. And when you look at all those disciplines, you actually see that nobody went back and rewrote the marketing rule book, given that we have all this new science. And so that's what we're doing. And I would say that's the hardest part of what we have to do. We need to work with marketers and chief marketing officers and explain to them that there is this new set of rules that's going to actually empower them to get results faster. So what that requires is just a change of mindset, and that's always a bit of a challenge.
And that change of mindset, I mean, it's, as you've alluded to, or directly spoken about, is, we have this one way of thinking about that approach for marketing and connecting with customers. And that approach, sure, I think, leaned a little bit on the unconscious, but a lot of it was on the conscious, on the packaging, on what you're seeing in that moment. But you've done such work, and we've touched on this, but delving into it more, that difference between conscious and subconscious marketing. Do you have, other examples that we could look to, or how that might show up in our own lives? And conversely, another question I have around there is, thinking about this topic as it relates to, have a diverse consumer base, and across the board, if it's by gender or other identity, are the applications the same?
That is such a phenomenal question. Two phenomenal questions. So let's start with conscious versus subconscious marketing. We have two parts of our brain. Well, we have many parts of our brain, but we have two major parts that help us make decisions, the conscious and the subconscious. And it turns out that when you try to persuade somebody to do something, you are encountering their conscious brain. And that conscious brain, which is very aware that you're trying to sell it something, says, don't you try to sell me. It's skeptical, it's resistant to change. The subconscious part of our brain, the instinctive brain, which is located in the reptilian complex, which processes information much faster, 40 million bits per second, that part of our brain is actually much easier to influence because it doesn't see you coming. So what subconscious marketing is all about is about leveraging the familiar anchors, leveraging the memories that already exist in people's brains and piggybacking onto those in order to expand the brand and change people's instinctive brand preference. It's really a much faster, easier, and less costly way to go.
And so fascinating. And do you see any differences in that approach across consumer identity?
So, in terms of diversity, what we have found over and over again is that human beings are far more similar than they are different. So, triggers, the whole notion of triggers is that we find these universal cues, codes, verbal triggers, language, everything that are just common to all of us. And we have a very similar understanding of these things across the board. And so, for the most part, brands actually can have very unified messages to all audiences. But then, absolutely, there are cultural differences. And so you can use other triggers that are tailored to those different audiences. But the overriding brand message, we've consistently found that the best model is sort of this overall brand, master brand that's similar across everybody, and then just lean into particular messaging nuances by target as necessary.
Are there any brands, I know you've worked with some spectacular brands, but are there any scenarios, brands, campaigns, products that really stand out to you in light of this conversation?
The interesting thing about the work out there is that companies are not using some of these shortcuts, these cognitive shortcuts, as much as they could be. And that's really leaving money on the table. But the companies that are gaining share, a lot of the disruptors that you see able to unseat a large company like Dollar Shave Club, able to take share from Gillette and Schick, or Robinhood more recently going after all of the largest financial services firms, they are using triggers. Just to give you an example of what we mean by a trigger, if you think of the bottled water category, there's the snow-capped mountain. The snow-capped mountain is a trigger because when you look at that, you know what it means. It's in your memory. And not only is it in your memory, so there's instant engagement when you see it, because we like to know, it validates us. There's tremendous meaning associated with it. Pure, pristine, cold, refreshing, glaciers. Some people even think that little people run to the top of the mountain and collect the glacier water in containers and bring it down the mountain. So, what you're doing with the use of triggers is you're leveraging those iconic cues that already exist in people's minds, and when you connect your brand to that, it makes the brand itself grow in people's minds, and then that in turn means that it's going to grow out in the marketplace.
I'm sitting here thinking about the Ellevate brand or other brands that I connect with, and when you really look at the imagery and the words and all of that, I'm having some aha moments here on the other side of this podcast recording. So this is definitely getting me thinking, Leslie. You made a discovery called the brand connectome, which you wrote about in Knowledge at Wharton. You've got some other great articles I've been reading around this as well, including Newsweek. But can you share more about that? What is the brand connectome and why is it important?
Absolutely. The brand connectome is an ecosystem of associations, positive and negative, that have accumulated over time in people's brains. Every brand has one, from McDonald's to Tide. Every candidate has one, from President Biden to President Trump. And even the whole notion of trying to close the gender gap in business, women in business, there's a connectome for that. So we have a connectome for everything. And the understanding of it is critical because it is literally the heart of how you make progress on anything that you're trying to do, whether you're trying to build a business, build a company, build your own personal brand, or drive a cause like this one, like closing the gender gap. So the way the brand connectome works is that there are only two things that make the brand connectome grow. There are two things you have to achieve. One, you want your brand to have the largest footprint in people's minds because then it's more salient in their brains and makes your brand the go-to. And secondly, you need to have a higher ratio of positive to negative associations. If you have a lot of negative associations, that's going to slow down your growth and make it less likely that people are going to choose your brand. So those are the two things that everybody needs to be working on, adding lots of positive associations and expanding that brand footprint. I think of it as a tree. So you're planting a seed in the brain. The seed is the brand, and you want to feed it all of these positive associations. The positive associations are like the soil, the water, and the sun. You feed the brand connectome positive associations, and little by little, it has to sprout new branches in order to hold those associations. Little by little, it grows and grows, And the more memory terrain the brand has in the brain, the more it becomes your go-to brand, the more you choose it, and the more you can make strides in all sorts of efforts.
What would be a negative association?
Well, a lot of food brands that haven't been updating their formulas over the past 10 years have suffered from associations about being overly processed or having chemicals in their food. So these are the brands that didn't work hard enough or fast enough to change their recipes to have no artificial flavors or colors, and less processing. That's an example of a negative association in the food category. And there are others in other categories.
And so these associations do evolve over time from a consumer standpoint. I mean, you may have been someone who always, went in on organic, all natural, and unprocessed, and others kind of come to that realization later on. But across the board, if a brand has a strong affinity with those values or practices, whenever that consumer, is enlightened, if you will, then they'll have enough of those positive associations with that brand to instinctively go in that direction.
That's exactly right. So, some of the large legacy food brands didn't make those changes as rapidly as they should have, and they were not monitoring their brand connectome. And in not monitoring their brand connectome, they didn't see that negative associations were accumulating, because the job of the marketer has to be to constantly prune those negative associations and replace them with positive associations. But if you don't know what you're up against, because most research just kind of gives you these very superficial tracking ideas like, oh, consumers are satisfied, they think your food tastes good, they think you give good customer service, but they don't get at those really nuanced instinctive drivers, then you might miss it altogether that those negative associations are accumulating. And the implication of that is actually the negative associations are directly related to lower growth, lower revenue growth.
You did a TEDx talk, which is fantastic. And, certainly are building your brand around this work that you're doing. And brand is something, I think is a term that kind of can be thrown around a lot. Businesses have brands, causes, individuals. But does any of this apply to the individual and to our listeners today? Are there things they should be thinking about in relation to their own brand?
Absolutely. So, this applies to building your personal brand just as much as it applies to building a company or building a cause, as we've just described. One of the old rules of marketing was that your brand should only stand for one thing. Advertising agencies tell marketers all the time, what's the one thing you want me to communicate in this advertisement? But one of the things that we've learned, and I just was explaining it in terms of the brand connectome, is that the larger your brand connectome, the more it becomes the go-to choice. And what that means is you need hundreds and thousands of branches and hundreds of thousands of associations to make a brand salient in the mind. So it's actually the exact opposite of what we've been told, that a brand should only stand for one thing. If Volvo just stands for safety, as an example, it's going to be invisible in people's brains because it's going to just have one branch. But what Volvo needs to do is have safety and innovation and quality, and it's got to look good and it's got to be good for the family. It's got to have many more positive associations than just that one theme. So, what that means is you still want all of your branches to kind of fall into an overall message umbrella, but it needs to be made up of lots of different varied components. And that's one of the things that we work on with our clients all the time. And it's what anybody can do when trying to build their own personal brand.
Oh, thank you, Leslie. This is so informative. I want to end on a little fun game that we do, asking you some questions specific to you. And if you could just answer in a few sentences or a few words or less. Are you introvert or extrovert?
Oh, I am totally an extrovert. I'm fascinated by what people think, people who agree with me or disagree with me. So, definitely an extrovert.
What would be your favorite day of the week?
This is embarrassing. I have to admit that it's Mondays because I'm a workaholic. I like to get things done.
I don't think that's embarrassing at all. I think that's great. It shows you really have passion for what you do. Are, are,
Thank you.
are you an early bird or a night owl?
I am totally a night owl, especially when inspiration strikes. I don't care if it's 4 in the morning, I'll get up and work in the middle of the night because I'm afraid I'll forget by morning, which is why I don't schedule a lot of 8 a.m. meetings.
Who would be your dream dinner guest?
My dream dinner guest would be my dad. He was my favorite person in the world. It's been 5 years and I still miss him every day.
Jim, that's very sweet. Do you have a pet peeve?
Yes, I have a pet peeve. So I'm somebody who grew up never getting into trouble at school or at home. I was definitely a goody two shoes, but I've always hated rules. I tend to question things, I don't blindly follow. It doesn't mean I run red lights, but I do think that some rules are kind of arbitrary and need to be broken.
That sounds fun. We'll have to dig into that deeper at some point, Leslie. What's your morning staple? What do you need to get your day started off?
I adopted a practice from the first company I worked at after college, which was Bain and Company. They had this Monday morning meeting where they asked everyone how their weekend was and let everybody know what's happening to improve communication. And I've been doing this, and it's particularly important, I think, during COVID.
Do you have a favorite recent read?
I'd have to say that my favorite thing that I read was when my husband and son had COVID during the holidays, and I went to go get my test. My favorite recent read was my negative COVID result.
That's a good one, and congrats. I'm glad that you had a negative test, Leslie. What's your top self-care practice?
I go to this airboxing class. And I'm going to give a shout out to Rob Forcelli, who ran this all through the pandemic. It's about 35 people outside. We did it through the winter, the summer, the fall, and then again through this last winter. I love the camaraderie. I felt we were all united, boxing our way through COVID together and punching the COVID virus in the gut. And Kristy, I know that you don't always love running, so I'm going to invite you to come up to Armonk and take a class with me. You will love it.
All right. That sounds I used to do kickboxing for a while and I loved it. It's a good way to get some aggression out.
Absolutely.
And then Leslie, do you have a final thought you want to leave with our listeners here today?
I would say that women have to help each other, carry as you climb. Men do it for their brothers all the time. And I think that means being willing to put your neck out for another woman. I don't know if we always do that for one another, but I think we need to. And I also don't think that we should wait until somebody asks you for help. I think if we see a need, we have to do it proactively.
Perfect. Well, Leslie, thank you so much for joining us today on the Ellevate podcast. It was a pleasure to chat with you and to learn more about the important work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much for listening to Ellevate. If you like what you hear, help a girl out. Subscribe to the Ellevate podcast on iTunes, give us 5 stars, and share your review. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at EllevateNTWK, that's Ellevate Network, and become a member. You can learn all about membership and all the great things that Ellevate Network is doing at our website, www.ellevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. And to our voiceover artist, Rachel Griesinger. Thanks so much, and join us next week.
Do you want an exciting career with unlimited potential? Demand and salaries for certified aircraft maintenance technicians have hit record levels and are still on the rise. Approved by the Federal Aviation Administration, Vaughn's Airframe and Power Plant Certification Program can put you on the path to a future-proof career in as little as 16 months. Come to Vaughn's on-campus info session Thursday, February 16th at 6 p.m. and learn about career options, the industries you can work in, how you can apply for free, and have a chance to win a scholarship. Register today at vaughninfosession.com.